Hello and welcome to CLAS,
the podcast brought to you from CLAS, the Centre of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge.
I'm Ellen.
And I'm Christy, and we're both MPhil students on the Latin American Studies course from 2017 to 2018.
Over the past few weeks, we've been talking to other students on the MPhil course about the dissertation.
The dissertation is 50% of the assessed part of the course and allows you to pursue a topic of your choice developed from an original proposal submitted as part of the application to the MPhil course. First, we talked to 4 students who carried out their dissertation research from Cambridge.
We asked them to describe their dissertation, then to talk about their progress and their decision not to carry out fieldwork.
We then talked to 4 students who carried out fieldwork as part of their dissertation research over the Easter break in April.
Carrying out fieldwork is optional and there are funding opportunities available.
We first asked them to describe their dissertation, then to tell us about what they did on fieldwork, and finally to share an interesting experience from their time away.
So we hope you enjoy listening to the podcast and hearing about the wide variety of topics studied this year. Myself and Chrissy will be offering some final reflections at the end.
First, we talked to Gabrielle, who's studying Brazil.
Okay, so I'm looking at how the Brazilian Workers' Party has sort of approached the Brazilian Constitution since the return to democracy in 1988. So it's basically a way to figure out how this sort of radical socialist movement sort of became gradually a ruling party. And I'm sort of trying to draw a parallel between how Brazilian democracy has consolidated in parallel with how the Workers' Party has become more prominent electorally. And everything that's happened in Brazil over the last 5 years, I sort of want to make the argument that sort of you can trace the sort of the challenges and the sort of vulnerabilities that Brazilian democracy is facing right now to sort of how the Workers' Party has sort of struggled to sort of attain political relevance. Okay, so I think the most interesting thing for me about this process of writing this dissertation has been grappling with this notion that we're producing original work and that we're sort of to some extent authorities in our field now, and sort of that we can't just regurgitate literature and sort of look at what other people have said, that we have to sort of provide new insights. Okay, for me the choice to not do fieldwork was more of a practical matter. I'm using some primary sources in terms of party documents, sort of resolutions from the Workers' Parties and things like that I could have gone to archives back in Brazil or sort of researched, but it's also things that I a lot of the times can find online anyways. And for me, the more recent things, the primary sources that I'm looking at can't be the party documents because they haven't revealed that yet. It's still confidential information anyways. So yeah, it was more of a practical choice where I knew I wouldn't have the access to the material that I wanted.
Chiara, working on Chile.
I've always been really interested in the power of language and how words influence people's perception of reality. And in my dissertation, I kind of explore this topic in the context of Chileans' perception of democracy. At the moment, there's quite a big debate in the academic literature whether Chileans are particularly dissatisfied with democracy since the transition in 1988, or whether there is a specific malaise with democracy amongst Chileans, and people have used different approaches to explore this topic. There are a lot of ethnographies, there's a lot of qualitative research using surveys to assess this. And I'm kind of looking at whether this dissatisfaction could also stem from the way politicians have been talking about democracy, so the narrative that has been created about democracy in 1988 and in 2018, and whether the competing visions and expectations that have been raised with regard to the democratic reality in Chile could have caused dissatisfactions amongst the Chileans. And that's why I do research with newspaper sources, both from 1988 and 2018. At the moment, I'm in a stage where I'm really looking forward to the deadline to handing in the dissertation, especially because as we had to write our proposal already when we were applying for the MPhil, the topic has just been on my mind for a very long time, and also the thought of having to write a 15,000 word dissertation. And the whole process throughout the year has been very up and down. Especially during the first and second term, I felt that I could never spend enough time on the thesis because we had to do coursework as well and research essays, which took up quite a long time. But at the same time, this other work has informed my proposal, so it has actually changed and evolved quite a lot more than I would have expected at the beginning, and throughout the year I've learned to accept that as something good and not as something bad. And because of the time constraint during the first and second term, I mainly did secondary reading, which I loved and at the same time feared, because I was worried that I would find somebody else's writing on the same thing that I would want to say, but so far it has not happened, so I'm lucky. And then the last part has been also very interesting, because looking at the primary sources has actually made me revise some of my initial hypotheses that I had. So in the end, I'm really looking forward to having my proposal on one hand and the final project on the other, and having learned that you should just be open to change in academic work. I think my attitude towards fieldwork has really evolved since I applied for this MPhil. My first thought when I read on the website of CLAS that we can do fieldwork was I shouldn't do fieldwork because I don't know how I can finance it. And with that in mind, I also already developed a research proposal that I thought wouldn't make me have to go on fieldwork. And then when I arrived in Cambridge and other people prepared to go on fieldwork, I realized that there are many more opportunities to get funding for your fieldwork than I thought, either through your college or through CLAS. So if I could travel back in time and give a piece of advice to my past self, I would say don't close yourself to this option, although I'm very happy with the research project I'm doing at the moment. And then doing my research process, I started to think that maybe also I should have gone on fieldwork, because what does it say about myself if I do a degree in Latin American Studies entirely based in Cambridge in the UK? We learned so much about Eurocentrism and that we should be vigilant of being very Eurocentric, so I thought maybe going to Chile would have helped me to avoid that. At the same time, I think, however, that not going on fieldwork, because the course is very short, has given me the time to be very diligent, and in that way I hope to be very aware and inclusive of different scholars also coming from Latin America, and in this way hopefully not be too Eurocentric in my approach.
Joe, who's studying Brazil, says,
So my dissertation research is on a cop watch group in Rio called Papo Reto, which roughly translates to straight talk, and looking at their work in relation to surveillance literature. So surveillance is a practice of reversing the gaze of surveillance on the authorities and those who usually practice the gaze. So I'm looking at their work in terms of two key questions or themes. So first of all, I'm looking at the footage they create and looking at how they go about structuring their images, the kind of positions they take, the techniques they use, and trying to think about if we can develop kind of a visual grammar of surveillance. And second of all, I'm looking at how their practices interact and relate to literature on the digital sphere, because all of their tools and the techniques they use are digital, so I'm looking at how that kind of digital aspect mediates their work, both as a facilitator and constraint. So I guess before Easter I was doing a lot of reading on different theories, kind of latest literature, and doing a big survey on what has been published to date. And then over Easter I actually began the analysis of the videos themselves, and it was really useful to see kind of the theory come into relation with the practice and see where theory did and didn't fit for this particular context in this particular group. And now I've finished that analysis, and I think I've got my argument and my key themes, so I'm beginning to write and kind of do the nitty-gritty building of my argument and putting my kind of analysis into readable words. So I decided not to pursue fieldwork, and I did that because at the time when I made the decisions I thought fieldwork was important for two reasons. One, particularly if you haven't been to the place that you're doing where the research is based, it's good to build a familiarity with the area that you're researching, and second of all, to actually conduct the interviews or the research itself. However, I've spent a lot of time in Rio before, so that wasn't necessarily as much of an issue. And previous to making the decision not to do fieldwork, I'd spoken to the group themselves, Papo Reto, and they'd shown interest, and they were happy to do interviews via Skype. So I thought I'd kind of save the time and have more time in the library here. So I made a decision not to go. However, kind of a few months down the line, much closer to the dissertation deadline, I actually think I should have gone on fieldwork. I've realised that it's actually a lot harder to kind of convince people to give up their time when you're not in person or when you're not there. I know that if I had been there, it may not have changed much, but I just feel like I would have had slightly more of a chance of convincing people to give me their time if I'd been in Rio and just kind of around the corner. But who knows? And also speaking to people coming back from research, there's so much kind of additional kind of little snippets of information and kind of sections of conversations or things that they see which have been important, will be important to their research, which I haven't necessarily got in mind.
And now we'll hear from Christy, who is working on literature in Chile.
For my dissertation, I'm studying Chilean authors writing during Pinochet's dictatorship and after, and I'm looking at a particular genre of literature called ludic literature. So ludic literature is literature with an overtly playful form, and the texts I'm looking at are often created according to strict rules. So, for instance, some of the texts have been written in the form of puzzles that adhere to a restricted format that the reader then has to solve. The purpose of my project is to show that there is a Chilean ludic literary canon, and that, unlike French ludic literature, Chilean ludic literature is overtly political, as the authors I'm looking at experiment with playful forms in their works in order to create acts of resistance and also acts of memory. And I also want to look at the importance of the materiality of the texts for their creation of acts of resistance and acts of memory. So I'll compare printed ludic works to virtual ludic works, such as a Chilean hypernovel. Finally, I also want to experiment with analysing non-ludic works that don't have overtly playful forms through a ludic lens in order to highlight how a ludic framework can actually be useful for drawing out ethical issues concerning the consumption of memory products. I've really enjoyed how my project has evolved over the year. I think it's such a marked difference talking about my dissertation now to talking about it at the beginning of the MPhil year, when I had this embryonic idea but I didn't really know how to expand on it, where it was going to go, and consistently found it difficult to explain my dissertation topic to people when I really wasn't sure what I was doing either. So it's nice to be in a position where I feel like my project has more direction now, and also knowing that that's a result of the work that I've been doing this year. However, I think working on the dissertation in the MPhil year is quite strange because it's constantly in the back of your mind throughout the year, but until you get to this point in the year, which is now the beginning of the last term, you have so many other things going on, like coursework and module reading to prepare for presentations, that you don't have time to focus wholeheartedly on the dissertation. So I did quite a bit of reading for the dissertation over the Christmas break, but then I had to put it on the back burner again while I did other coursework. So it's a real relief now to actually have the time. It's a luxury as well, to just have the dissertation to be working on at the moment. Earlier on in the MPhil year, I was actually thinking about doing fieldwork. I was thinking of going to Santiago in Chile to do archival research. There were some primary texts that I hadn't been able to get hold of. However, as the year progressed, I was speaking to archivists in Chile, and they were very kind and actually scanned in those texts that I needed. So I was able to access them virtually from Cambridge. So because of that, I decided not to do fieldwork, and I think I was also slightly worried about the time pressures of the MPhil. It's such a short course that I felt that going abroad for 2 weeks potentially to do this archival research, while valid, would be quite rushed within the MPhil year. Having said that, it's been great hearing about everyone's experiences, people who went on fieldwork, and it's clearly added so much value to their dissertation research and also, helped to fuel their passion for their subject that they're writing about. So there are definitely pros and cons, but I feel like for my specific project this year, I think I did make the right decision. And Ellen, working on Colombia, says,
so my dissertation focuses on the idea of reconciliation in Colombia, both pre and post the signing of the 2016 peace agreement. I'm comparing the practices of reconciliation that use education, that are defined and supported by the Colombian state, with practices that are developed by community organizations and NGOs in Bogota. So I carried out fieldwork in Bogota over 3 weeks in April. I interviewed 10 different government officials and representatives from NGOs and community organizations. And I also observed some of the activities carried out by these organizations in 2 very different contexts in Bogota, one in an alternative school in a neighborhood that's been affected by the conflict, and another in a very prestigious private school. I also observed the 9th of April Dia de las Víctimas ceremonies led by the Alcaldía de Bogotá, and I also watched a guided tour of the Centro de Memoria, Paz y Reconciliación. So one of the most interesting experiences of my fieldwork trip was visiting an alternative school, Casa Memoria Viva, in El Codito, an area that's been quite heavily affected by the conflict. One of these sessions involved tending to Casa Memoria Viva's community garden in a space that was previously just a rubbish heap, and kind of seeing the strong links between public space, land, renovating space, and reconciliation was very interesting. Also hearing about the importance of this community space to the teenagers and young people that we were working with was really fascinating. And they were also very keen to tell me that I should really improve my gardening skills and how important this was for kind of the next generation to learn how to tend to plants and the land and how to cultivate crops. We'll now hear from Jay, who carried out fieldwork in 2 different locations in Colombia.
My dissertation will be based on the work of Andrés Caicedo, who was a writer from Cali, Colombia in the 1970s. I'm analysing his work and looking at the invasion and reshaping of national cultural space by transnational capital. And I'm looking at the ways in which Andrés Caicedo uses music, sex and drugs and the invasion of North American culture to construct a narrative of a tragic modernity, but also how he uses these things to make critical commentary on the Colombian elite and politics of modernity. In the Easter vacation, I went to Colombia. I first went to Cali, which is central to Andrés Caicedo's work, and it's where all of his short stories are set. My main goal was to map the city of Cali, and in doing so I traced the north of the city to the south and visited all of the places where his characters frequent, and did a comparison between 1970s maps of Cali and how these same places are now, and how they've been transformed by a transnational capital. I also went to relevant exhibitions at the Modern Art Museum in Cali, and after my time in Cali, I went to Bogota, where I uncovered some archives of his that have been left unpublished due to controversy in his family, and I looked at his unpublished work in order to look at recurrent themes of consumption and tragic modernity.
Xian's research also led her to Bogota, where she carried out 3 weeks of fieldwork.
So my dissertation is about the translation of gender in the context of the Colombian peace process. During the recent referendum on ending the civil war between the FARC and the government, the No campaign, to everybody's surprise, won the plebiscite. So you could vote yes for peace or no for not peace, and no won. And one of the reasons that they won was that people believed that there was something called gender ideology in the agreement, which they didn't like, and therefore voted no. So they wouldn't have to accept gender ideology into their constitution. So on my fieldwork, I interviewed various groups of people, people from kind of feminist and LGBT NGOs, academics, some civil servants from the Interior Ministry, but mostly evangelical pastors, about gender ideology, what they think it is, what it had to do with the peace agreement, and more specifically, the accusation that it's a foreign imposition or a foreign import. So I'd say the most interesting thing that happened was all of the evangelical pastors I got to talk to who have some pretty out there views that I don't often come across. And I was quite worried at first that they would, I don't know, maybe ask some very probing personal questions. And it turned out that fear was well-founded, because they did indeed ask some personal, quite probing questions about my personal beliefs, marital status, sexual orientation, and things of that ilk. And I knew full well that I would be best placed to withhold that information in as diplomatic a way as possible if I wished the interview to continue down the route that I wished it to proceed down.
And finally, we talked to Juliet, working on vallenato music in Colombia.
In my dissertation, I'm going to be looking at different constructions of identity in Colombia, so racial identity, class, geographical identity, politics and gender, and looking at how they interrogate or are interrogated through expressions of vallenato music. And each one will be led through a different figure in the vallenato movement, and looking at how that figure in particular has been pivotal in the kind of creation of vallenato as the nexus of Colombian identity.
I travelled to Colombia between Lent and Easter term to conduct fieldwork to support my thesis. So I spent time in both Bogota, researching in libraries, accessing material that I would not otherwise have had access to in the UK. And then I travelled up to Valledupar, which is considered the birthplace and home of vallenato music, where I conducted a number of interviews with musicians, and just generally kind of conducted ethnography in the streets, learning about the city and the culture of vallenato. I had a lot of very interesting experiences in my fieldwork, but perhaps the strangest was when I wasn't even meant to be doing any fieldwork. I was just walking through the streets of Valledupar and bumped into a guy who turned out to be leading a commemoration for probably the most prominent vallenato king, Alejo Duran, who then took me for a beer and sat down and gave me an impromptu interview.
So now we're looking back on the year, having done our dissertation. It's really interesting to see all together in the podcast a wide variety of subjects and approaches.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that was one of the reasons why I applied as well. I really wanted to experience that interdisciplinary dialogue, which I knew the course had because of the breadth of the course itself, but it's been so nice to talk to other people on the course about what they're doing, because they are writing in different disciplines, and so we have that interdisciplinary dialogue just amongst ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, having said that, it's also really interesting to see how people's projects have evolved throughout the year, having heard little snippets of it, having heard their doubts, their worries about their projects, and then it all coming together at the end. And I think we only started to see that completely in the research day.
Definitely, yeah. So we had the MPhil research day a few weeks ago, where we all had the opportunity to present our projects, to get feedback, for people to ask questions, and that was really brilliant to see in detail how people's projects had evolved. And I think what's really interesting is that since we recorded the podcast, people's projects have evolved even further from then until the actual deadline, which was just a few days ago.
Yeah, I think Chiara mentioned how the project evolves.
Yeah, definitely. Chiara picked up on that specifically, and I think it's a really good point. I think another really good point that's come out of what people have said is Gabrielle talking about how we have found a voice with our dissertation, how we've sort of become almost authorities on
on our projects.
Yeah.
And I think that's something really special about the MPhil.
I think that point is really important because the MPhil hasn't just been about learning how to carry out research or like growing as researchers, but also kind of finding our voice and finding confidence in your own ideas.
Definitely, and I think we both agree by saying that the only way that we were able to find that confidence was with the support of CLAS, with everyone that works in CLAS, but also with the support of our whole cohort. And I think that's been a really productive environment to work in.
Definitely.
O sentir que trago cresce quando estou longe de mim.